Whispers echo louder than gunshots in the dusty streets of Oakhaven, Colorado. For Josephine Mercer, those whispers carried a singular, cruel sentence: barren. In a brutal 1878 frontier society where a woman's worth was weighed entirely by the sons she could bear, an empty womb was a public disgrace, cast aside by her ambitious fiancé and subtly shunned by the church congregation. She resigned herself to a solitary fade into the high desert obscurity. Then came the legendary blizzard of '79, and with it, a massive, frost-bitten shadow descending from the treacherous peaks of the San Juan Range, a grieving outcast hauling a sled of half-frozen children, desperately looking for a miracle. The wind howling through the Colorado Territory carried a bitter, biting cold that stripped the leaves from the cottonwoods long before November had officially laid its claim. In the small, judgmental settlement of Oakhaven, survival was a community effort, built on large families and calloused hands. Yet, for 28-year-old Josephine Mercer, survival was an intensely solitary endeavor. Josephine lived in a small, weathered clapboard cabin on the very edge of town, a physical manifestation of her social standing. Her isolation was not born of malice or scandal in the traditional sense, but of a biological failing that the frontier deemed unforgivable. 3 years prior, a traveling physician, a grim man named Dr. Harrison Fordyce, had sat in her parlor and delivered the devastating verdict. After her second agonizing miscarriage, he had wiped his spectacles, sighed heavily, and stated that her womb was inhospitable, scarred beyond repair. The news had not stayed within the walls of her home. In a town where privacy was a myth, the truth leaked out like water from a cracked canteen. The immediate casualty was her engagement. Samuel Tucker, a prosperous cattle rancher with eyes set on building a dynasty, had broken their betrothal within the fortnight. "A ranch needs heirs, Josie," he had told her, his voice devoid of the warmth that had once promised her a lifetime of devotion. "A man can't build an empire on empty rooms." Within 6 months, Samuel had married Betty Lou Higgins, the 19-year-old daughter of the town's most prolific gossip, Mrs. Henrietta Higgins. Now, Betty Lou paraded down Main Street, her belly swollen with Samuel's second child, casting pitying, sidelong glances at Josephine whenever they crossed paths outside the general store. "Such a shame," Henrietta Higgins would loud whisper to anyone within earshot as Josephine purchased her meager supplies of flour and coffee. "A woman without a child is like a wagon without wheels, just sitting there, gathering dust, serving no earthly purpose to the Lord." Josephine bore the indignities with a stoic, rigid spine. She had a sharp mind, a compassionate heart, and hands that possessed an almost miraculous skill for healing and sewing. She supported herself by mending the heavy canvas dusters of trail riders and brewing willow bark and echinacea tinctures that even the local pharmacist quietly purchased when his own stock ran low. Yet none of her skills could bridge the chasm between her and the town's respectable women, who gathered for quilting bees and harvest suppers, swapping stories of teething and colic, a club she was permanently barred from entering. Her cabin was impeccably clean, filled with the scent of drying lavender and wood smoke. But the silence inside was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that amplified the ticking of the mantel clock, a constant reminder of the time slipping away, of a youth fading into a solitary middle age. She poured her stifled maternal love into a small garden of resilient winter vegetables and stray barn cats, wrapping her bruised heart in a thick layer of defensive ice. She had convinced herself that she needed no one. If the world had decided she was defective, she would simply withdraw from the world. But the frontier is a harsh mistress, and it rarely allows isolation to remain peaceful. As November bled into December, the sky over Oakhaven turned the color of bruised iron. The old-timers at the saloon spoke in hushed tones of a winter unlike any they had seen since the '60s. The air grew so frigid that pine trees snapped in the night, sounding like rifle fire echoing through the valley. The town battened down the hatches, hoarding firewood and salted meat. Josephine sat by her hearth one late evening, repairing a heavy wool blanket, the fire casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The wind shrieked against the window panes, demanding entry. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, completely unaware that a desperate force of nature was currently fighting its way down the treacherous slopes of the San Juan Mountains, heading straight for her door. High above Oakhaven, Where the air was thin and the terrain unforgiving, Jedediah Boone was losing a battle against God and the elements. Jedediah was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he inhabited, standing 6'4", with a thick beard and shoulders that could hoist a full-grown buck. He was a solitary trapper and logger who had chosen the high peaks to escape the suffocating crush of civilization. The townsfolk of Oakhaven called him the Beast of the San Juan, whispering rumors that he was an outlaw hiding from a hangman's noose in Kansas, or a madman who conversed with wolves. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more tragic. Jedediah was a widower. 2 years ago, his beloved wife, Sarah, had succumbed to a raging fever mere days after bringing their 5th child, Levi, into the world. Her death had shattered the mountain man, leaving him stranded in a high-altitude cabin with a newborn and 4 terrified children. Since that day, Jedediah had fought with a ferocity bordering on madness to keep his family alive. There was Ezekiel, 14 and carrying the burden of a man, Clementine, 11, who had aged 10 years overnight to fill her mother's shoes, Wyatt, 8, a whirlwind of reckless energy, Cora, 5, born frail and constantly battling the mountain chill, and little Levi, now a robust, babbling 2-year-old who knew no mother but his older sister and his grizzly bear of a father. They were a pack, fiercely loyal and isolated from a world that viewed them with suspicion, but as the blizzard of 79 from the peaks, dropping 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours, their secluded sanctuary became a frozen tomb. The catastrophe began with a simple cough. Little Cora had been out with Wyatt, gathering kindling near the timberline when the temperature plummeted. By nightfall, the cough had deepened into a wet, rattling wheeze. Within 48 hours, the 5-year-old was burning with a terrifying fever, her small chest heaving as she fought for every breath. Jedediah exhausted his limited medical knowledge. He applied hot poultices of pine pitch and mustard, fed her broth, and sat up for 3 consecutive nights holding her tiny, convulsing body against his chest, praying to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. But the frontier was unforgiving, and pneumonia cared little for a father's desperate prayers. By the dawn of the 4th day, Cora's lips were tinted a terrifying shade of blue, and her eyes were rolling back into her head. "She's dying, Pa," Ezekiel said, his voice cracking as he stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his jaw tight to keep from crying. Jedediah looked down at his daughter. He had buried his wife in the frozen earth. He would not bury his child. "Bundle them up," he growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "All of them. We're going down the mountain." "Pa, the snow is chest-high in the pass," Clementine protested, holding baby Levi tightly. "We'll freeze. We stay. She dies," Jedediah replied, wrapping Cora in 3 heavy bear pelts and strapping her securely to a wooden transport sled he used for hauling logs. "Pack whatever food is left. We leave in 10 minutes." The descent was a journey through hell frozen over. The wind whipped the snow into a blinding whiteout. Jedediah harnessed himself to the sled, pulling not just the weight of the wood and his dying daughter, but the metaphorical weight of his family's survival. Ezekiel walked beside him, holding a rope attached to Wyatt and Clementine, who carried Levi strapped to her back. They fought the mountain for 14 agonizing hours. Frostbite nipped at their noses and fingers. Wyatt fell twice, sobbing into the snow, and Jedediah had to physically drag him to his feet, bellowing over the wind to keep moving. Every time Jedediah looked back at the sled, he feared he would find Cora's chest still, but the slight rise and fall beneath the heavy furs pushed him to take another agonizing step. When the faint, flickering lights of Oakhaven finally pierced through the driving snow, Jedediah collapsed to his knees, his lungs burning like they were filled with crushed glass. But he forced himself up. He was a dangerous, imposing sight, a massive, ice-crusted giant, leading a procession of half-dead, shivering children through the dark, deserted streets of the town. He bypassed the saloon and headed straight for the center of town, pounding his massive, gloved fist against the door of Dr. Henderson's clinic. Bang, bang, bang. The door cracked open, revealing the elderly doctor holding a lantern, his breath smelling faintly of whiskey. He took one look at the towering mountain man, the wild look in Jedediah's eyes, and the ice clinging to his beard. "My girl," Jedediah gasped, pointing to the sled. "Pneumonia. She needs help. Dr. Henderson peered out at the sled, then at the other 4 filthy, freezing children. Fear warred with his Hippocratic oath. Boone? Lord Almighty, man. I can't take all of you in here. I have respectable patients in the back ward with the winter flu. You people are filthy. You could be carrying cholera from the high camps. Jedediah grabbed the doctor by his woolen nightshirt, lifting the smaller man onto his toes. I ain't asking for a bed for me. Save my daughter. Unhand me, the doctor shrieked, panicked. Ezekiel stepped forward, grabbing his father's arm. Pa, don't. He won't help if you hit him. Jedediah dropped the man, his chest heaving. Please, he begged, a raw, humiliating sound. I'll give you a bottle of quinine, the doctor stammered, backing into his clinic. But you can't stay here. Try the church. He tossed a small glass bottle into the snow and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt. Jedediah stared at the closed door, a murderous rage warring with absolute despair. He turned his children toward the parsonage, but Reverend Thomas Caldwell wouldn't even open the door, shouting through the frosted glass that the church basement was already full of stranded stagecoach passengers, and there was no room for mountain vagrants. The town of Oakhaven, so proud of its Christian charity, had bolted its doors against them. Pa? Wyatt whimpered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. I'm so cold. Jedediah looked around the dark, unyielding town. His daughter was slipping away. His children were freezing to death in the street. Then, he saw it. A single, solitary lantern glowing weakly in the window of a small cabin at the very edge of town, isolated from the rest of the houses. With the last remnants of his strength, Jedediah dragged the sled toward the solitary light, praying that whoever lived in the outcast's home would have more mercy than the righteous townsfolk. Josephine was just about to extinguish the oil lamp and retreat beneath her heavy quilts, when a sound broke through the howling wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding on her front door, followed by a muffled shout. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Living alone on the outskirts of a frontier town meant that a late-night knock rarely brought good tidings. She reached toward the mantel, wrapping her fingers around the cold iron grip of her late father's Colt revolver. Holding it behind the folds of her skirt, she cautiously approached the door. Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling slightly. Help. A deep, ragged voice croaked from the other side. Please, God. Help us. Josephine hesitated, but the sheer desperation in the voice overrode her fear. She threw the latch and pulled the door open, the wind immediately rushing in, scattering the ashes in her hearth. She gasped, instinctively raising the revolver. Standing in her doorway was a veritable giant, covered in snow and ice, his face obscured by a frozen beard and a battered hat. But it wasn't the man that made her drop the gun to her side. It was what surrounded him. 4 shivering children, their faces pale and pinched with cold, huddled behind his massive frame, and at his feet lay a wooden sled bearing a bundle of heavy furs. They locked their doors, Jedediah rasped, his eyes locking onto hers. They were dark, haunted eyes, devoid of the wildness the town gossips claimed, filled only with the raw terror of a parent losing a child. My little girl, she's dying. Please, I have gold. I have pelts. Just let them by the fire. Josephine didn't see the beast of the San Juan. She didn't see a dangerous outcast. She saw children freezing to death. The maternal instinct that the town swore she lacked, the instinct she had tried so desperately to bury, roared to life within her like a starved fire given sudden oxygen. Bring her in, Josephine commanded, her voice suddenly crisp and authoritative. She stepped back, opening the door wide. Get them all inside. Quickly. Shut the door behind you to keep the draft out. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He lifted the heavy bundle from the sled and carried Cora inside, laying her gently on Josephine's braided rug before the hearth. The other children shuffled in, their teeth chattering so violently it sounded like castanets. Josephine sprang into action. She ignored the mud and melting snow ruining her pristine floors. She knelt beside the bundle, pulling back the heavy bare fur. The sight of little Cora made Josephine's breath catch. The child was impossibly small, her skin a terrifying, translucent blue, her breathing a horrifying, rattling squeak. Pneumonia? Josephine asked, looking up at the towering man who stood helplessly in her parlor. Yes, Jedediah nodded. 4 days. She needs steam, immediately, Josephine said, pointing at the oldest boy. Ezekiel, you, go to the kitchen. There is an iron kettle on the stove. Pump water into it and bring it here. Then find the stack of dry towels in the cabinet next to the stove. Ezekiel, usually defiant and distrustful of townspeople, found himself moving instantly under her command. She turned to Clementine, who was swaying on her feet, clutching the toddler. Give me the baby. Sit down on that rocking chair before you collapse. Get those wet boots off. Josephine took little Levi. The toddler was terrified, crying out for his sister, but Josephine held him firmly against her chest, feeling the heat of his small body. For a split second, the sensation of holding a child struck her with a profound, agonizing grief, a ghost of the life she was denied, but she shoved the emotion down, locking it away. This was not the time for her own ghosts. She deposited Levi into Clementine's lap, then grabbed an armful of heavy wool blankets from a chest and threw them to Jedediah. Strip the wet clothes off the boys. Wrap them in these. Sit them as close to the fire as they can stand without burning. Jedediah obeyed, his massive, clumsy hands gently peeling the frozen coats from Wyatt and Ezekiel. Josephine ran to her apothecary cabinet, pulling out dried eucalyptus, peppermint, and a potent tincture of willow bark. When Ezekiel brought the kettle, she shoved it directly into the hottest part of the coals. As the water began to boil, she threw the herbs into it. Instantly, the sharp, medicinal scent filled the small cabin. Help me lift her, Josephine told Jedediah. Together, they carefully raised Cora. Josephine draped a large, heavy blanket over her own head, Cora's head, and the steaming kettle, creating a small enclosed tent. Breathe, sweet girl, Josephine whispered softly, holding the child's small, limp hand. Breathe in the hot air. For the first 20 minutes, there was no change. The heat under the blanket was stifling, and Josephine's face dripped with sweat. She gently massaged Cora's chest, trying to loosen the phlegm that was drowning the child from the inside out. Jedediah paced behind them like a caged panther, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Is she? Jedediah couldn't finish the sentence. She is fighting, Josephine replied firmly from under the blanket, and we are going to fight with her. She emerged, gasping for cooler air, and immediately measured a few drops of the willow bark tincture into a spoon. Hold her jaw open, she instructed Jedediah. He knelt beside her, his massive fingers incredibly gentle as he parted his daughter's lips. Josephine slipped the medicine down her throat, massaging her neck to force a swallow. The night dissolved into a blur of frantic, desperate labor. Josephine moved between the children like a commanding general. She heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in flannel, placing them at the feet of Wyatt and Ezekiel. She brewed a thick, sweet tea of honey and chamomile for Clementine and Levi, forcing the shivering girl to drink. Hours bled away. The storm raged outside, burying the cabin in snow, completely cutting them off from the sleeping town of Oakhaven. Inside, a bizarre tableau had formed. The barren outcast, deemed useless by society, was single-handedly keeping 5 children and a mountain man alive. Around 3 in the morning, the harsh, rattling sound in Cora's chest suddenly shifted. It softened, turning into a deep, wet cough. The child retched, expelling a mass of dark fluid onto the towel Josephine held. Then, Cora took a deep, clear breath. The bluish tint began to recede from her lips, replaced by a pale, flushed pink. The fever, which had been burning like a furnace, finally broke, leaving the little girl drenched in sweat but breathing evenly. She opened her eyes, hazy and unfocused, and murmured, "Pa?" Jedediah dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands, his massive shoulders shaking as a single, ragged sob escaped his chest. He reached out, stroking his daughter's matted hair. "I'm here, Bird." "Pa's here." Josephine sat back on her heels, exhausted to the bone. Her dress was ruined, her hair was plastered to her face, and her hands were blistered from the hot kettle. She looked around her parlor. Ezekiel and Wyatt were asleep on the floor, tangled in blankets like a litter of puppies. Clementine dozed in the rocking chair, Levi curled securely on her chest, and kneeling before her, the beast of the San Juan looked up. The fierce, intimidating trapper wiped his eyes with the back of a grimy hand. He looked at Josephine, really looked at her. Seeing past the weary face and the messy hair, he saw the fierce, unyielding protection she had offered his blood. "They turned us away," Jedediah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctor. The preacher. They let us freeze. Why didn't you?" Josephine looked at the sleeping children, a profound, painful ache settling in her chest. She met Jedediah's gaze, her expression a mix of sorrow and a strange, newfound strength. "Because," Josephine answered quietly, her voice steady against the howling wind outside. "This town believes my home is empty, but I'll be damned if I let it become a graveyard." For 3 unbroken days and nights, the blizzard of '79 held the Colorado Territory in a merciless stranglehold. The town of Oakhaven vanished beneath a sea of white, but inside Josephine Mercer's small clapboard cabin, an unexpected universe had burst into existence. The suffocating silence that had defined Josephine's life for years was entirely obliterated. In its place was a chaotic, beautiful cacophony. There was the constant, reassuring sound of little Cora's steady breathing as she recovered on the rug. There was the heavy, rhythmic thud of Jedediah Boone's boots as he paced the small confines, perpetually tending the fire. There was the endless chatter of 8-year-old Wyatt, who possessed an insatiable curiosity about Josephine's apothecary jars, and the quiet, assessing gaze of 14-year-old Ezekiel, who watched her every move with the protective vigilance of a sheepdog. Then, there was Levi, the 2-year-old toddler, detached from his older sister Clementine for the first time since their mother's death, had inexplicably decided that Josephine was his new anchor. As she stood at the cast-iron stove frying a meager ration of salt pork and cornmeal mush, she felt a sudden weight against her skirts. Looking down, she found Levi clutching her hem, his thumb in his mouth, staring up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Up," he demanded, raising his chubby arms. Josephine froze. The wooden spoon trembled in her grip. For a woman told her body was a barren wasteland, the simple, demanding trust of a child was a physical blow. She glanced over her shoulder. Jedediah was sitting by the hearth, whittling a piece of pine, but his dark eyes were fixed squarely on her, watching intently. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Josephine wiped her hands on her apron and bent down, hoisting the heavy, warm weight of the boy onto her hip. He immediately buried his face into the crook of her neck, smelling of wood smoke and dried lavender. A fractured, breathless sigh escaped Josephine's lips. It felt like coming home to a house she had never been allowed to enter. "He ain't usually that quick to take to strangers," Jedediah rumbled, his deep voice vibrating through the small room. "Children know who is willing to carry them," Josephine replied softly, turning back to the stove. By the dawn of the 5th day, the wind finally ceased its shrieking. The sky broke open into a brilliant, blinding blue, and the temperature began to creep upward. The town of Oakhaven slowly dug itself out of its frozen tombs. Men with shovels forged paths down Main Street, and the general store threw open its doors. It did not take long for the town to notice the anomalies at the edge of the settlement. Henrietta Higgins, emerging to inspect the damage to her prized frozen rose bushes, squinted toward Josephine's cabin. Smoke poured merrily from the chimney, but it was the tracks in the snow that drew her sharp, gossiping eye. Massive, deep trenches carved through the snowbanks, leading directly from the center of town to the spinster's door. Within 2 hours, the rumor mill of Oakhaven was churning faster than the lumber mill on the river. The mountain giant had not frozen in the streets. He was holed up with Josephine Mercer. The perceived scandal was too delicious for the town to ignore, and the bruised egos of the men who had turned the Boone family away required a scapegoat to alleviate their own guilt. If Josephine had taken them in, she must be either a hostage or a woman of compromised virtue. Shortly past noon, a heavy, authoritative pounding rattled Josephine's door. Jedediah, who was sitting at the table repairing a broken snowshoe with a leather awl, immediately stood up. His massive frame seemed to swallow the light in the room. He reached for his sharps rifle leaning against the wall, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. "No," Josephine said firmly. stepping between him and the weapon. "This is my house. I will answer my door." She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and threw the door open. Standing on her porch, looking simultaneously righteous and heavily armed, was a deputation of Oakhaven's finest. Sheriff Montgomery Monty Callahan stood in front, a Winchester rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. Beside him was Mayor Thaddeus Beaumont, looking deeply uncomfortable and lingering toward the back, wrapped in an expensive beaver pelt coat, was Samuel Tucker. Josephine's eyes narrowed at the sight of her former fiancé. "Sheriff Callahan, Mayor, to what do I owe this overwhelming display of civic duty?" "Morning, Miss Josie," Sheriff Callahan said, tipping his hat, though his eyes darted nervously over her shoulder, trying to peer into the dim cabin. We noticed the tracks." The town was rightly concerned. "Word is, that wild mountain man forced his way into your home during the storm. We're here to escort him out and make sure you're unharmed." "I am perfectly unharmed, Sheriff," Josephine stated, her voice as crisp and cold as the icicles hanging from her eaves, "and no one forced their way into my home." Samuel Tucker stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Now, Josie, don't be a fool. You're a woman alone. You don't know the kind of danger you're in. That man is a savage. He dragged his brats through the streets like a madman." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of the man who had abandoned her for being barren, now calling children brats, ignited a fire in Josephine's blood that she had suppressed for 3 years. "Those children, Samuel, were freezing to death," Josephine said, her voice rising, ringing out over the snow-muffled plains. "A 5-year-old girl was drowning in her own lungs with pneumonia." And where was the town's legendary Christian charity? Reverend Caldwell barred his doors. "Doctor," Henderson threw a bottle of quinine into the snow and left them to die. "You all sat in your warm parlors and let a father and his babies freeze." Mayor Beaumont flushed a deep, ugly red. "Now see here, Miss Mercer, there were protocols. The flu is going around." "Cowardice is what's going around, Thaddeus," Josephine snapped. Suddenly, a massive hand rested on Josephine's shoulder. Jedediah stepped out onto the porch behind her. He didn't have his rifle, but he didn't need it. At 6'4", corded with thick muscle and staring down at the townsfolk with eyes as hard as flint, he was a terrifying sight. Sheriff Callahan involuntarily took a step backward, his grip tightening on his Winchester. "The lady told you her piece," Jedediah growled, his voice a low, rumbling menace. "She took us in when the righteous folks of this town turned us away. You owe her your apologies, and then you need to get off her land." Samuel scoffed, though his voice wavered. "We don't take orders from squatters and drifters, and we certainly don't let our respectable women live in sin with them. The town council won't stand for it, Josie. If he stays, you're done in Oakhaven." "I was done in Oakhaven the day Dr. Fordyce told you my womb was empty, Samuel." Josephine delivered the blow with lethal precision, watching Samuel pale at the public mention of their private shame. "This town made me a ghost long before this storm hit. At least Mr. Boone brought life back into this house." She turned, pushing Jedediah gently back inside, and slammed the door in the faces of the town's most prominent men, throwing the heavy iron deadbolt with a resounding clack. Inside, the cabin was dead silent. The children were staring at her with wide eyes. Jedediah looked at her, his expression unreadable, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. "They'll ruin you for this," Jedediah said quietly. "They'll starve you out." Josephine walked back to the stove, picking up her wooden spoon. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was forged of steel. They can certainly try. The town's retaliation was swift, silent, and brutal. True to Samuel Tucker's veiled threat, Oakhaven initiated a total embargo against Josephine Mercer. When she walked to the general store to purchase flour 2 days later, Jebediah Jeb Miller, a man she had bought supplies from for a decade, refused to look her in the eye. "Can't serve you, Josie," Jeb muttered, wiping down a perfectly clean counter. "Mayor's orders. Says your money is tainted by associating with outlaws. Says you're a bad influence on the town's morals." Her apothecary business, her sole source of income, evaporated overnight. The trail riders were warned away, and the local pharmacist suddenly found a new supplier in Denver. The message was perfectly clear. Cast the mountain man out, or starve. For 2 weeks, Josephine and the Boones lived off the meager supplies in her cellar and the elk meat Jedediah had brought down on his sled. But the supplies were dwindling rapidly. 7 mouths to feed was a mathematical impossibility for a woman with no income. Late one evening, after the children were finally asleep, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. The fire was burning low, casting a golden, flickering glow over the room. Josephine sat in her rocking chair, meticulously darning a hole in Ezekiel's wool trousers. Jedediah sat opposite her on a wooden stool, sharpening his hunting knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic sh, sh, sh of the steel was the only sound. "Cora is breathing clear," Jedediah said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Color is back in her cheeks. Wyatt and Ezekiel got their strength back. They are resilient children," Josephine agreed, not looking up from her needlework. "The pass is clearing," Jedediah continued, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a heavy, reluctant weight. "Snow is melting fast enough. I figure we can make the trek back up to the claim by the end of the week." Josephine's needle stopped mid-stitch. A cold, sharp panic seized her chest, far more terrifying than the blizzard had been. The thought of the cabin returning to its suffocating, empty silence, the thought of little Levi's laughter vanishing, of Cora's sweet smiles disappearing into the harsh mountain wilderness, made her physically nauseous. "You can't take them back up there, Jedediah," she said, her voice tight. "Cora's lungs are still scarred. The high-altitude air will trigger a relapse, and winter isn't over. If another storm hits, you won't survive the descent a second time." "I know that," Jedediah snapped, the sudden harshness in his voice startling her. He dragged a hand down his face, looking utterly defeated. "You think I don't know that? I nearly killed my own babies because I was too stubborn to come down off that mountain after Sarah died." He stood up, pacing the small room, his massive frame agitated. "But I can't stay here, Josie. I'm a trapper. My lines are up there. My timber is up there. If I don't work, I can't buy them food. And I sure as hell can't leave them here to ruin your life any more than I already have. You're starving because of me." Josephine laid the trousers in her lap. "I was starving for a life long before you arrived, Mr. Boone. They just made it literal." Jedediah stopped pacing. He turned to face her, the firelight catching the deep, sorrowful lines etched around his eyes. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. "There's only one way this works," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. "I have gold dust and pelts buried under the floorboards of my mountain cabin, enough to buy out a piece of land down here in the valley, enough to build a proper house. But I can't raise a toddler and a sick girl and run a timber claim at the same time. They need a mother." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the wooden arms of the rocking chair until her knuckles turned white. "And you," Jedediah continued, taking a step closer, "you need protection. You need a name that makes men like Samuel Tucker cross the street when they see you coming. You need a family, Josie, the one they told you that you couldn't have." He knelt before her, a mountain of a man bringing himself down to her eye level. He didn't reach for her hand, respectful of the boundaries that still existed between them. "I ain't a gentleman," Jedediah said plainly, his dark eyes fiercely sincere. "I'm rough, and I'm loud, and I carry a lot of ghosts. But I swear on my life, if you take my name, you will never want for anything. I will hunt for you. I will build for you, and I will protect you. And my children, they already look at you like you hung the moon." It was not a declaration of sweeping, passionate love. It was a proposal of survival, forged in the brutal fires of the frontier. It was a business arrangement of the heart. Yet, to Josephine, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. He wasn't asking for a fertile womb to build an empire. He was asking for her strength, her heart, and her hands to save the empire he already had. "A marriage of convenience," Josephine whispered, a single tear escaping her eye and tracking down her cheek. "A marriage of necessity," Jedediah corrected gently. "For all of us." Josephine looked over at the sleeping children. She thought of the empty, agonizing years she had spent mourning the babies she couldn't carry. And then she looked at the man offering her 5 living, breathing souls who desperately needed her. "Yes," she breathed. Yes, Jedediah, I will marry you. The next morning, the town of Oakhaven was treated to a sight they would gossip about for decades. Down the center of Main Street walked Jedediah Boone, wearing a clean, albeit patched, wool jacket. Beside him walked Josephine Mercer, her chin held high, wearing her best dark blue Sunday dress. Trailing behind them, scrubbed clean and wearing their best surviving clothes, were the 5 Boone children. They marched directly to the courthouse. Judge Hiram Peabody, a perpetually sour man with mutton chop whiskers, looked up from his ledger as the imposing group filled his small office. He recognized Jedediah from the rumors and Josephine from the town's collective shunning. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" Judge Peabody demanded, adjusting his spectacles. Jedediah slammed a heavy leather pouch onto the judge's desk. The unmistakable, heavy clinking of gold coins echoed in the room. "We require a marriage license, Judge," Jedediah stated, his voice booming in the confined space. "And your services to officiate it." Right now, Judge Peabody looked from the gold to Jedediah, then to Josephine. "Miss Mercer, the town council has expressed deep concerns regarding your association with this individual. Are you being coerced?" "The only coercion in this town, Hiram, is your mayor trying to starve me out," Josephine replied, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I am marrying Mr. Boone of my own free will. Now, write the license, or we will take our gold to the magistrate in Durango and tell them exactly why. Money talks louder than morality on the frontier." With trembling hands, Judge Peabody filled out the required forms. Marriage record. Oakhaven Territory date. The 14th of December 1879 groom. Jedediah Thomas Boone bride. Josephine Martha Mercer officiant. Honorable Judge Hiram Peabody. The ceremony took exactly 4 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, and no congratulatory embraces from friends. There was only the stale air of the courthouse and the solemn vows exchanged between 2 outcasts. "I pronounce you man and wife," Judge Peabody muttered hastily, stamping the seal on the document. "May God have mercy on you both." When they stepped back out into the freezing Colorado air, Josephine Boone felt a profound, tectonic shift in the universe. She looked down at her hand, where a simple braided leather band fashioned by Jedediah the night before now rested on her ring finger. Suddenly, a small, cold hand slipped into hers. She looked down to see Wyatt grinning up at her. "Can we have flapjacks to celebrate, Ma?" the 8-year-old asked, his eyes shining. The word hit her like a physical shockwave. "Ma!" Josephine looked up at her new husband. Jedediah was watching her, a rare, genuine smile softening the harsh lines of his bearded face. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the monumental weight of the moment. "Yes, Wyatt," Josephine said, her voice trembling with an overwhelming miraculous joy. She tightened her grip on the boy's hand. "We can have all the flapjacks you want. Let's go home." The brutal winter of 1879 finally broke its grip on the Colorado Territory in late March, turning the frozen wagon ruts of Oakhaven into a thick, sucking mire of spring mud. Inside the Boone cabin, however, a profound and undeniable warmth had taken root. The marriage of convenience had transformed Josephine's life into a vibrant, exhausting, and deeply fulfilling rhythm. She was a mother in every way that mattered. She bandaged Wyatt's scraped knees, taught Clementine how to read from a battered family Bible, and sat up nights with Ezekiel, listening to the 14-year-old's quiet fears about the future. Yet, the shadow of starvation still loomed. The town's embargo had not wavered. Mayor Beaumont and Samuel Tucker ensured that not a single merchant would trade with the Boone family. The elk meat was gone, the flour bin was scraping bottom, and Jedediah knew the time had come to execute their desperate gamble. "I have to go back up to the timber claim," Jedediah announced one evening, strapping his heavy leather gun belt around his waist. "The snow in the pass has melted enough to get a horse through. I'll dig up the lockbox and the winter pelts. We'll have enough capital to buy land in the valley, far away from Beaumont's jurisdiction." Josephine felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "How long will you be gone?" 4 days at most," Jedediah replied, his massive hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Over the past 3 months, A quiet, simmering tension had built between them, a profound mutual respect that was slowly, inevitably bleeding into genuine affection. He looked down at her, his dark eyes softening. "Lock the door, Josie. Keep Ezekiel's rifle loaded. I can take care of our family, Jedediah. Just come back to us." He nodded, a silent promise, and rode out before dawn on his massive roan gelding, Goliath. What neither Jedediah nor Josephine knew was that their transaction at the courthouse had sealed a target on the mountain man's back. Judge Hiram Peabody, fueled by cheap whiskey at the Golden Nugget Saloon, had loudly complained to Samuel Tucker about the heavy pouch of gold Jedediah had casually tossed onto his desk. Samuel, his pride wounded by Josephine's public defiance, and his own ranch struggling under heavy winter cattle losses, saw an opportunity for both vengeance and sudden wealth. Samuel quietly hired 2 drifters known to run with the notorious remnants of the Clanton Gang, a ruthless sharpshooter named Theron Hayes and a knife fighter known only as Calico Bill. Their orders were simple: track the beast of the San Juan, take his buried gold, and ensure he never came down from the mountain alive. On the 3rd day of Jedediah's absence, the trap snapped shut. High near the timberline, Jedediah had successfully unearthed his heavy iron lockbox, filled with 3 years of panning dust and prime beaver plues. He had just secured the saddlebags on Goliath when a rifle shot cracked through the thin mountain air. The bullet tore through Jedediah's left shoulder, the kinetic force spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the slush. Goliath reared, terrified by the gunshot and the sudden spray of blood, and bolted down the treacherous mountain trail, leaving Jedediah stranded. Theron Hayes and Calico Bill stepped out from behind a cluster of ponderosa pines, weapons drawn, grinning at the downed giant. "End of the line, mountain man," Theron sneered, leveling his Winchester. "Tucker sends his regards." But the men of Oak Haven had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Jedediah Boone was not a gentleman rancher. He was a survivor forged in the most unforgiving wilderness in America. Ignoring the blinding pain in his shattered shoulder, Jedediah didn't surrender. He lunged. With a terrifying guttural roar, he threw his hunting knife with deadly precision, burying it into Calico Bill's thigh. As the man screamed and went down, Theron fired wildly, the bullet grazing Jedediah's ribs. Before Theron could work the lever action again, the massive trapper was upon him. The sheer, desperate will to return to his family fueled Jedediah's massive frame. A brutal, bloody fistfight ensued on the edge of a 300-foot ravine. When the dust settled, Theron Hayes lay unconscious with a broken jaw, and Calico Bill was begging for his life, bleeding heavily in the snow. Jedediah stood victorious, but he was losing blood at an alarming rate. He secured the iron box to his back using his belt, tied a brutal tourniquet around his bleeding shoulder with his good hand, and began the agonizing 10-mile walk down the mountain. Down in the valley, dusk was settling over the cabin when Josephine heard the frantic whinny of a horse. She threw open the door to find Goliath standing in the yard, his chest heaving, his saddle empty and smeared with dark, dried blood. Panic, icy and paralyzing, threatened to consume her. But Josephine Boone was no longer the fragile, defeated spinster of Oak Haven. She was a matriarch. "Ezekiel," Josephine barked, her voice cracking like a whip. "Saddle my mare. Grab the lanterns and the medical bag. Clementine, bolt this door and do not open it for anyone but us." Riding bareback and driven by a primal terror, Josephine and Ezekiel pushed up the darkening mountain trail. They rode for 3 hours, the lantern light cutting through the creeping fog, calling Jedediah's name until their voices were hoarse. Just past midnight, they found him. Jedediah was collapsed against a boulder near the creek, crossing, his breathing shallow, his face ashen. The iron box was still stubbornly strapped to his chest. "Jedediah." Josephine dropped from her horse while it was still moving, sliding in the mud to reach him. She tore open his bloody shirt, her skilled hands flying over the gunshot wound. Jedediah's eyes fluttered open. He looked at the woman kneeling in the mud, her face pale with terror for him, and a weak, bloody smile touched his lips. "Told you, I'd come back. You stubborn, foolish man," Josephine sobbed, pressing a wad of clean gauze into the wound. She looked up at Ezekiel. "Help me get him on the horse. If we don't stop this bleeding, He won't make the sunrise. Working by lantern light on the side of a mountain, Josephine performed a miracle. Using whiskey from her kit to clean the wound and a pair of forceps to extract the lead fragments lodged against his collarbone, she stitched the muscle back together with steady, fearless hands. She saved his life. 2 weeks later, the town of Oakhaven experienced a reckoning it would never forget. The doors of the Oakhaven Territorial Bank swung open, and Jedediah Boone walked in. His left arm was bound tightly in a sling, but he stood as tall and imposing as ever. Beside him walked Josephine, her arm looped proudly through his good one. Sheriff Callahan and Samuel Tucker were standing at the teller's counter, discussing a loan to save Tucker's failing cattle operation. They froze as the Boones approached. "Morning, Horace," Jedediah said, addressing the bank manager. Horace Pendleton, while completely ignoring Tucker. Jedediah slammed the heavy iron box onto the mahogany counter. He popped the latch, revealing a blinding fortune of raw gold dust and heavy nuggets. "I hear the old Hawthorne tract is up for auction due to back taxes," Jedediah announced, his voice carrying through the silent bank. 400 acres of prime riverfront grazing land. Horace Pendleton swallowed hard, staring at the gold. "Yes, Mr. Boone, it is. But Mr. Tucker here was just inquiring about extending a line of credit to purchase." "I'm buying it in cash," Jedediah interrupted, his dark eyes locking onto Samuel Tucker's pale face. "And I'm putting the deed entirely in my wife's name." Samuel's jaw dropped. The Hawthorne tract was the most valuable piece of real estate in the county, bordering his own failing ranch. To have the woman he discarded as useless become the wealthiest landowner in Oakhaven was a humiliation beyond measure. "You can't do this," Samuel sputtered, turning red. "Sheriff, this man is a criminal. My men, men on the mountain, said he attacked them." Sheriff Callahan slowly took a step away from Tucker. "Actually, Samuel, Calico Bill limped into my jail 2 days ago, sang like a canary, said a local rancher paid him to murder a man for his gold. I have a warrant for your arrest right here in my pocket." As the sheriff slapped irons onto a protesting, weeping Samuel Tucker, Jedediah turned to his wife. He reached out with his good hand, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Right there in the middle of the bank, surrounded by the town that had tried to break them both, he pulled her into a deep, claiming kiss. It wasn't a kiss of convenience. It was a kiss of profound, consuming love. "I didn't just marry you for them, Josie," Jedediah whispered against her lips, his voice thick with emotion. "I married you for me. You're the strongest thing I've ever known." Josephine rested her hand against his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. The whispers of Oakhaven had finally been silenced, replaced by the unbreakable roar of a family forged in iron and ice. The legacy of the Boone family became a cornerstone of Colorado history. Josephine Boone, the woman Oakhaven had cruelly discarded as barren, became the fierce, beloved matriarch of the sprawling Silver Creek Ranch. While she never birthed a child of her own blood, her immense capacity for love raised 5 extraordinary citizens. Ezekiel became a prominent territorial judge, fiercely defending the marginalized. Clementine founded Oakhaven's first integrated schoolhouse. Wyatt expanded the ranch into a multi-state cattle empire. Cora, whose fragile lungs grew strong in the valley, became a renowned physician. And little Levi grew up to be the town's most beloved mayor. Jedediah and Josephine spent 4 decades together, their bond an unbreakable testament to resilience. In the end, the frontier learned a vital, humbling truth. A family is not solely defined by the blood in its veins, but by the relentless, unconditional love chosen in the darkest of storms.